Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the south here, southwest of Novomikhailivka. The Russians have advanced towards the road between Konstantinivka and Vuhledar, as they have managed to cross over a few fortified positions of the Ukrainians, capturing another forest line and moving across towards this lake here in between the Russian and Ukrainian positions. So we're seeing that positional fighting continues here in the direction of Vodiane, Konstantinivka and Vuhledar as the Russians slowly inch forward in a western direction along the entirety of the road. We've seen positional fighting taking place all the way from Pereskoivka to the north, where the Russians captured the final parts of the village, and all the way down south to Volodymyrivka, where in between the open fields here that are located between the Russian and Ukrainian positions, positional fighting continues as the Russians push along the entirety of it. So the Russians are here fighting on a wide front where they are attacking on one spot at a time. This is to keep the Ukrainians spread across the entirety of the front line. If the Russians simply concentrated all of their forces in one spot, so could the Ukrainians, setting up extensive defensive lines. Instead, the Russians are trying to split the Ukrainians across the entirety of it, slowly bombarding the areas, after which they push one place at a time. If the Ukrainians then send reinforcements, they will hit them with these long-range shots. So we see that the Russians are attempting to keep the Ukrainians on the move. When you're on the move, that is when you're the most vulnerable, before setting up your positions, after which you will have a powerful position. The Russians slowly inching forward. We see positional fighting throughout the month of June with no significant push, no significant offensive, just continuous positional fighting. Further north here in direction of Yasnobrudivka, the Russians have now captured the entirety of the village. There are forest areas here to the west of the village which remain under Ukrainian control or in a gray zone. This is fortified position to the northeast. There's no clear indication that the Russians have captured it, but the Russians have flanked its position. Therefore, it is unlikely that the Ukrainians still hold on to it. If they do, then they are cut off completely from supplies. To the north, there's this river line, and to the west, Russians are positioned. So we see that the Russians have managed to capture the entirety of Yasnobrudivka and will likely capture this entire area west of Yasnobrudivka towards the lakes, and in between Umanske to Skushne will likely fall into Russian control over the next few weeks, as the Russians have now captured Yasnobrudivka, securing the eastern parts. They'll have to fight through Karelivka, the northern parts of it, to reach the crossing over the lakes. And in the northern section, they simply need to push along the fields, capturing those, or simply push directly towards Skushne, avoiding this entirety of the area, as they could completely cut them off from supplies by reaching Skushne. Further north here in the direction of Orelivka and Turetsk, we see that the Russians have managed to advance further, where they've managed to push the Ukrainians a bit away from Sumy, fully capturing the first line of defense as they've captured further fortified positions along the front line. And with this, the Russians are now moving on to the second phase, which is getting a foothold here in the next part in between the first and second lines of defense before actually attacking the second line of defense. Ukraine's first line of defense is very well fortified, but the geographical positions are fairly even. On the second line of defense, there is these high grounds, there are better buildings, industrial areas, apartment complex areas, and these are also very well fortified. Secondary hill here as well. So we see that the Ukrainian second line of defense is much more difficult for the Russians to break through than the first line of defense was, as there are multiple layers and multiple geographical advantages for the Ukrainians in this area. There's also behind these second line of defense, there are a forest area which allows the Ukrainians to send units and reinforcements in the cover of the forest, allowing for continuous supply to these fortified positions without worrying about constant Russian surveillance, as it is limited in the forest areas. However, it is also very possible for the Russians to simply heavily bombard the entirety of the forest areas with the firepower they have available. The same here with the area between Sumy and the first line of defense and the second line of defense. The Russians can move through this forest area, capture it, and use that to build up its forces ahead of pushing into the residential area with the apartment complexes and industrial zone, as well as the high ground areas. So we'll likely see a long period of very heavy fighting here in the residential area, as the next line of defense of the Ukrainians is very tough and it will take a long time for the Russians to push through if they manage to do so, and the Ukrainians will be able to hold on for a very long time. However, what is clear from this push is that the Russians are planning on gaining a foothold and pushing towards Toretsk because of the direction of fighting and the fact that the Russians are actually consolidating their gains before pushing on. We see that they initially managed to capture parts of the fortified positions in the first line of defense, after which they expanded to capture Shumi, and now they're expanding even further, capturing all of the fortified positions nearby and gaining a foothold in the forest area. This shows that the Russians are now, with this, having a foothold within the area, the gray zone between the first and second lines of defense, which indicates a push further, and a push beyond the second line of defense is directly towards Toretsk itself. This is a conglomerate of several villages and settlements of the Ukrainians, and we see that the entire area is completely well fortified since 2014. And the Ukrainians have this as one of the main areas of defense since 2014. This is also the final part of the front line from 2014 that the Ukrainians still have control of near the front line. This shows that this is the final part where the Ukrainians have such significant fortified positions. All of the other areas are more recently built from 2020 and onwards, which are more recent, and the majority of which are actually built after 2022, after the start of the invasion. And this means that they simply have not had enough time to build as intricate fortified positions as they have had prior to the invasion. As I said previously, the Russians moving on to capture Toretsk would open up a new front towards Konstantinivka. We're currently seeing the Russians pushing in the direction of Chasiv Yar and to the north of Avdiivka. Pushing along the Orlivka direction as well would mean a full front Konstantinivka battle, as the Russians would be able to advance from the west, southeast, and northeast, which would leave Konstantinivka with only one supply road in and out of the city, which would mean that the Russians could operationally encircle the city, while at the same time the heights overlooking Chasiv Yar allows direct fire from Chasiv Yar towards the road between Konstantinivka and Druskivka. So we see Konstantinivka would be in a very dangerous position if the Russians manage to actually push through Toretsk. Even if the Russians don't and they push from the south from Avdiivka and from the east through Chasiv Yar and Bakhmut, they would be able to cut off the similar situation where it is from the east and from the southwest. However, the issue would be that the Ukrainians would be able to hit the flanks of the Russians by pushing through from Toretsk towards those positions flanking them, while if the Russians manage to secure Toretsk as well, they'll have a very secure southeastern flank, and they'll have to focus only on the western flank and towards the city itself, which would significantly improve the position of the Russians during that fighting. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here to the southeast of Sinkivka, the Russians have continued positional fighting, where they've managed to advance and capture this small forest line, and they are continuing positional fighting along the east of Sinkivka, following the other two advances here in the area. We see in the north, in the Kharkiv direction, the Ukrainians have actually crossed back over towards Staritsia and managed to gain a foothold within the village again. So we're seeing positional fighting not just continuing in the direction of Vovchansk and Hlyboke, but also restarted in Staritsia, where the Ukrainians plan here in the north to completely recapture the entirety of the Kharkiv region. Now, recently I've been talking about how the Ukrainians continuously recapture parts of the front here in the northern region. However, I want to clarify that although the Ukrainians do have the initiative due to the manpower advantage that they currently have, and the Russians are hard-pressed to hold their positions, they have so far been able to do so, with the Ukrainians only recapturing these parts over these past few weeks. At the same time, in the direction of Vovchansk, for example, the Ukrainians have managed to recapture parts of the front. But to clarify, the main part of the Ukrainian positions within the northern parts of Vovchansk is the apartment complex area here in the center and the aggregate plant, or what is under Ukrainian control, the eastern parts of it. These are the two main sectors of the concentration of Ukrainian forces. From this, small units have been pushed beyond, but they are unlikely completely in control of this area. And in the other areas, there is not a large concentration of Ukrainian forces. They move along the road. This is why they captured the aggregate plant, the eastern parts of it, to secure the supply route. They move along it through the park and then to the apartment complex areas where they gather their forces. The main reason for this is when the heavy bombardment happens, the small buildings, they tend to be completely destroyed. That means that you are guaranteed to not survive such an explosion if the bombs hit you. However, in the apartment complex areas, there is a possibility that you survive. Well, that brings us to this video here, which shows the exact situation of the Ukrainian soldiers in the apartment complex areas. We first see these explosives that happened in the residential area here just east of the apartment complex areas. But what follows is this video part here where several FAB bombs land pretty much on the exact same spot. I count throughout this wave of FAB bombs, 5 FAB bombs in just this one area here on the northeastern parts of the apartment complex area. So we see that the Russians are heavily bombarding this area specifically. We see something similar in History Legends video.
According to this Ukrainian soldier on Twitter, on the 17th of June alone between 9 and 11 p.m., Russian aviation dropped 19 FAB bombs on Vovchansk.
In a span of just 2 hours, the Russians dropped 19 FAB bombs just within Vovchansk, and I believe the majority of those happened here in the northern parts, where the Ukrainians have positions across the Vovcha river line. This means that the Ukrainians are suffering significant casualties here in the northern parts. It is reported by Russian sources that the idea of the battle in Vovchansk is simply to recreate another Meatgrinder, where the Ukrainians continuously send troops across the Vovcha river line to get hammered down by Russian firepower. And so far it seems that that is fairly accurate based on the evidence which is provided, which is the heavy bombardment and complete destruction of the town. So the video I made that for some reason completely blew up and got me one of my most viewed videos ever on this channel, the Russian trap. Is it still accurate? I believe so, yes. This is a Russian trap for the Ukrainians and they fell right into it and they continue to do so. Therefore, I predict that the Ukrainians will not actually succeed here in the Battle of Vovchansk. I instead predict that the Russians will come out on top. Despite the momentum currently being in Ukraine's favor, the Russians will likely turn the situation around and win this current battle. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.